The gavel slammed down, sending a sharp echo through the packed courtroom. "Order," Judge Whitmore barked, his face twisted in amusement. He leaned forward, smirking down at the man standing in the defendant's position. "Mr. Zelenskyy," he drawled, exaggerating the name. "I must say, I never expected you to defend yourself. A comedian playing a lawyer, that's rich." Laughter rippled through the audience. Journalists scribbling furiously, waiting for their next viral headline. The prosecutor, an overconfident bulldog in a navy blue suit, smirked, watching Zelenskyy like a cat watches a mouse. But the man at the center of it all didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his tie, let the moment stretch, then smiled. "Your Honor," Zelenskyy said, his voice smooth and calculated. "I appreciate the humor, but I'm afraid the only joke here is the prosecution's case." Gasps, a few suppressed chuckles. Whitmore's smirk faltered. Zelenskyy turned to the jury, eyes locking with each member. He wasn't just defending himself, he was controlling the room. "Let's start with the facts," he continued, "because unlike my career in entertainment, this case is a bad script." The court leaned in. The game had begun. The scandal hit like a thunderclap. The first headlines were vague but ominous. "Breaking evidence surfaces in high-profile corruption case." Then, within hours, the speculation turned into a full-blown media circus. Zelenskyy caught in secret bribery deal. Career in jeopardy. TV networks looped a grainy surveillance video of a dimly lit backroom where a man, who vaguely resembled him, accepted a briefcase of cash. A distorted voiceover claimed, "This is the proof we've all been waiting for." By morning, opposition leaders were calling for his immediate resignation. Analysts dissected every frame, every pixel, speculating on his guilt. Social media exploded with debates. His supporters were in disbelief. His enemies were celebrating. Volodymyr Zelenskyy sat in his office, watching it all unfold on a silent television screen. "It's a fabrication," he said simply, his voice calm but laced with steel. His chief advisor, Dmytro, wasn't as composed. He paced furiously, phone clutched in his fist. "Fabrication or not, people believe it," he snapped. "This isn't just some scandal we can ignore. The prosecution is already moving to press charges." Zelenskyy exhaled slowly. He had seen manufactured controversies before, accusations designed to discredit him. But this was different. This time, they weren't just coming for his reputation. They were coming for everything. The knock at the door was firm, impatient. A group of officers entered, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. Zelenskyy," one of them said, "you are under investigation for corruption and abuse of power. We need you to come with us." Dmytro stepped forward, ready to argue, but Zelenskyy raised a hand, silencing him. "I want my lawyer," he said, meeting their gaze. The lead officer hesitated before delivering the real blow. "Your legal team has all recused themselves." Silence. Dmytro turned pale. Zelenskyy's attorneys, seasoned professionals, had all suddenly decided they couldn't represent him. That wasn't just a legal issue, it was a trap. Zelenskyy inhaled sharply, then straightened his tie. "Then I'll defend myself." The officers exchanged glances, confused. Dmytro's jaw dropped. "Volodymyr what?" Zelenskyy smirked. "They think they've written the perfect story," he said, "but I know how to change the ending." The cold, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Zelenskyy sat in the holding room, his hands clasped together, deep in thought. Across from him, Dmytro was pacing like a caged animal, muttering under his breath, "This is insane, insane." Dmytro stopped abruptly, turning to face him. "Do you realize what you're saying? You can't just defend yourself in a courtroom. That's suicide." Zelenskyy smirked, leaning back against the chair. "They already took my lawyers. If I hire a new one, they'll find a way to get rid of them too." His voice was steady, his mind already calculating the next move. "So, I do it myself." Dmytro dragged a hand through his hair, exhaling in frustration. "Volodymyr, this isn't a debate stage. This is war. They're going to rip you apart in that courtroom." Zelenskyy's expression didn't change. "You forget," he said, his voice edged with quiet confidence. "I've spent my entire career handling skeptics, dodging attacks, and winning over tough crowds. This isn't war, it's theater, and they're underestimating their lead actor." Dmytro scoffed. Cute, but the prosecution has evidence, witnesses. They're out for blood. Zelenskyy leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. That video is fake, Dmytro. If we can prove that, they have nothing. Dmytro hesitated. And how exactly do we prove it? A knock at the door interrupted them. A guard entered. You're up next, he said, his expression unreadable. Zelenskyy rose smoothly, adjusting his tie. We start with reasonable doubt, pick apart their case, brick by brick, and when the time is right, we expose the truth. Dmytro shook his head, still incredulous. You really think you can pull this off? Zelenskyy flashed a grin. Have I ever lost a stage? Before Dmytro could answer, Zelenskyy strode past him, walking toward the courtroom with the confidence of a man who had already planned his victory. Dmytro let out a breath, rubbing his temples. This is either going to be genius, he muttered, following after him, or the biggest disaster in history. But deep down, a part of him couldn't help but wonder, maybe, just maybe, Zelenskyy had been preparing for this moment his whole life. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the gallery, their cameras flashing as Zelenskyy walked in, unshackled, unbothered, and completely in control. The air was thick with tension, a mixture of hushed whispers and the distant clicks of pens against notepads. Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses, peering down at the defendant with thinly veiled amusement. Mr. Zelenskyy, he said, his voice dripping with skepticism, I assume you're aware that representing oneself is unwise. Zelenskyy smoothed his tie, offering a polite nod. Your Honor, I appreciate the concern, but I assure you, I know exactly what I'm doing. From the prosecution table, Antonov, the lead prosecutor, let out a quiet chuckle. He was a stocky man with a bulldog scowl, a reputation for ruthless convictions, and an ego as large as the case he was trying to build. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Antonov began, striding confidently across the courtroom. This is a simple case. A man caught red-handed in a secret deal, accepting bribes, betraying the very people he swore to serve. He turned, facing the jury with a practiced smirk. We have the evidence, we have the witnesses, and most importantly, we have the truth. The jury exchanged glances, a few nodding slightly. Antonov continued, waving a hand toward Zelenskyy. And now this man, this entertainer, thinks he can walk in here and turn this into a performance. But ladies and gentlemen, this is not a stage, this is not a joke, this is a court of law, and justice will be served. Zelenskyy sat motionless, watching Antonov with mild amusement. He let the moment stretch, let the words settle. Then, as the courtroom fell into a heavy silence, he stood. Buttoning his jacket, he approached the jury, slowly, deliberately. You've been told this case is simple, he said, his voice calm but commanding, that the evidence is clear, that guilt is undeniable. But let me ask you, have you ever seen a magic trick? A few jurors frowned in confusion. Zelenskyy continued, a magician makes you look at his left hand, while his right hand pulls the strings. He builds an illusion. He makes you believe you saw something you didn't. He turned, locking eyes with Antonov. And today, ladies and gentlemen, I will prove to you that this case is nothing more than an illusion. The courtroom held its breath. The real battle had just begun. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the projector hummed to life. Antonov stood confidently before the jury, his arms crossed as the grainy surveillance footage played on the large screen. The video was dark and shaky, but the image was clear enough. A man resembling Zelenskyy sat at a table, while another slid a briefcase of cash toward him, the supposed smoking gun. Antonov paused the footage dramatically. There you have it, he declared, turning to the jury. Caught in the act. You've all seen it with your own eyes. Zelenskyy, still seated at his table, didn't move, didn't flinch. He let the moment hang in the air, let the jury absorb it. Then, slowly, he stood up. Your Honor, he said, hands casually clasped behind his back. I have one simple request before we continue. Judge Whitmore sighed, adjusting his glasses. Proceed. Zelenskyy gestured toward the screen. Play it again. Antonov frowned, but nodded to the technician, who restarted the video. The same shadowy figures, the same transaction, the same damning evidence. Zelenskyy took a few slow steps toward the screen. Fascinating, he murmured. Truly fascinating. He turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a digital world, a world where we can place dinosaurs in movie scenes, make actors decades younger, and even create entirely new realities with artificial intelligence. He paused, letting the thought settle. What we see isn't always what's real. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Zelenskyy pointed at the paused image on the screen. Now, I ask a simple question. Who filmed this? Antonov's jaw tightened. That's irrelevant. Zelenskyy smiled. Irrelevant? You're asking a jury to convict me based on a video, and you don't think it matters where it came from. A few jurors exchanged glances. The first crack in the prosecution's case. Zelenskyy walked toward Antonov, keeping his tone light but precise. Tell me, prosecutor, have you reviewed the original file? Antonov hesitated. Zelenskyy turned back to the jury, his voice lowering slightly, forcing them to lean in. Ladies and gentlemen, they don't have the original file. Gasps spread through the courtroom. Zelenskyy let the reaction linger before delivering the final blow. And that, my friends, is what we call reasonable doubt. Antonov was rattled. It wasn't obvious. Not yet. But Zelenskyy could see it. The prosecutor had expected this to be an easy win, a grand performance where he played the hero and Zelenskyy the villain. But now, the cracks were showing. Time to widen them. The prosecution calls Yuri Malenko to the stand, Antonov announced, his voice steady, but with just a hint of forced confidence. A man in his late 50s shuffled up, his suit slightly wrinkled, his hands gripping the railing as he took a seat. Malenko was their star witness, a supposed insider who had seen everything firsthand. Antonov wasted no time. Mr. Malenko, can you confirm for the jury that you were in the room when the defendant received the bribe? Malenko nodded. Yes, I was there. I saw him take the money with my own eyes. Zelenskyy let the words settle, watching the jury. Some leaned forward, nodding slightly. Antonov continued, and are you absolutely certain that the man in that video is Volodymyr Zelenskyy? Without a doubt, Malenko replied. It was him. A strong, confident answer. Too confident. When it was Zelenskyy's turn, he rose slowly, straightening his cuffs. His voice was calm, almost casual. Mr. Malenko, he said, thank you for being here today. Malenko nodded stiffly. You testified that you saw me in that room, correct? Yes. You were close enough to see details, my face, my expressions? Yes. Tell me then, Zelenskyy said, pausing just long enough for tension to build. What color were the curtains? Silence. Malenko blinked. Excuse me. The curtains, Zelenskyy repeated, walking slowly toward the stand. What color were they? Malenko shifted in his seat. Red, I think. Zelenskyy turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit C into evidence. Dmitro, seated behind him, stood and handed a document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses as he skimmed the page. Then, his expression changed. Mr. Malenko, Zelenskyy said, his voice cool. This document confirms that the building in question has no curtains at all. Gasps filled the courtroom. Malenko's face drained of color. Zelenskyy turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, do you still believe what you see? The courtroom was still buzzing from Zelenskyy's takedown of the prosecution's star witness. The jury had exchanged glances, some skeptical, others intrigued. Even Judge Whitmore, who had seemed amused by Zelenskyy's decision to represent himself, now watched him with sharper interest. But the person most affected was Antonov. The prosecutor's face remained carefully neutral, but Zelenskyy had been in enough high-pressure situations to recognize when someone was scrambling beneath the surface. Good. Time to turn up the heat. Court was adjourned for the afternoon recess, and as soon as the judge stepped out, Antonov stormed toward Zelenskyy. You're playing a dangerous game, he hissed under his breath. Zelenskyy simply smiled, adjusting his cuffs. Oh, I thought I was just putting on a show. Antonov's jaw tightened. You think you're clever, but theatrics won't save you. I have more witnesses, more evidence. Zelenskyy stepped closer, his voice dropping just enough to make Antonov lean in. Let me tell you something about storytelling, prosecutor, he said smoothly. You don't introduce a twist unless you can handle the fallout. Antonov's face darkened. We'll see about that. Zelenskyy watched as he stalked off. then turned to Dmytro, who had been waiting in the corner of the room. "Well," Dmytro said, shaking his head, "you just put a target on your back." Zelenskyy smirked. "Oh, Dmytro, that target was there the second they realized they couldn't control me." Dmytro sighed, lowering his voice. "I have something." Zelenskyy raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Dmytro glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot. "Our team's been digging. The original footage, the real footage, exists. Someone inside the prosecution tampered with it." Zelenskyy's smirk faded. His mind raced. He had suspected the video was fake, but proof, that changed everything. "Where is it?" "We're close. We just need more time." Zelenskyy exhaled slowly, calculating his next move. "Buy it for me." Dmytro hesitated. "How?" Zelenskyy's smile returned, but this time it was razor sharp. "By making Antonov so desperate to win that he overplays his hand." Dmytro groaned. "This is the part where I say you're insane, right?" Zelenskyy clapped him on the shoulder. "No, this is the part where you say I'm winning." Dmytro's phone buzzed. A single message flashed on the screen. "We found it." His breath caught, heart pounding. He glanced across the nearly empty courtroom, where Zelenskyy sat at the defense table, cool as ever, flipping through his notes. Dmytro strode over, lowering his voice. "Volodymyr," he murmured, "we have it." Zelenskyy didn't look up. "The original footage?" Dmytro nodded. "Raw, untouched. And it's not just that the video was edited. The entire thing was a fabrication. The man in the footage? Not you. AI-enhanced face swap. Whoever made it knew exactly what they were doing." For the first time all day, Zelenskyy paused. He finally lifted his gaze, eyes sharp as a blade. "Who?" Dmytro's throat went dry. "It traces back to the prosecution's office." Silence. Zelenskyy leaned back in his chair, a slow smile curling at the edges of his lips. Well, he mused. "It looks like I was never on trial after all." Dmytro exhaled. "We can take this straight to the judge. This should get the case thrown out immediately." But Zelenskyy was shaking his head. "Not yet." Dmytro stared. "Not yet. We have the proof. The entire case is built on a lie." Zelenskyy tapped a finger on the table. "Exactly. And if we expose it now, Antonov will cry foul, claim it's planted evidence, and buy himself time to bury the truth. But if we let him think he's still in control, he'll walk right into his own downfall." Dmytro ran a hand down his face. "So what's the play?" Zelenskyy's grin widened. "Simple. We let him win." Dmytro blinked. "I'm sorry." "What?" Zelenskyy leaned in, lowering his voice. "Tomorrow, Antonov will come into this courtroom, thinking he's one step away from victory. He'll get cocky. He'll push harder. And right when he thinks he has me cornered," he sat back, folding his hands together. "We drop the hammer." Dmytro studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Remind me never to play chess against you." Zelenskyy smirked. "Smart man." The stage was set. Tomorrow, Antonov wouldn't just lose the case. He'd lose everything. The courtroom was electric the next morning. The press was packed tighter than ever. The jury looked restless, and Antonov was smug. Zelenskyy saw it in the way the prosecutor walked. Head high, steps deliberate, as if victory was already his. He was going to push for the final blow today, and that was exactly what Zelenskyy wanted. Judge Whitmore banged the gavel. "Prosecution, you may proceed." Antonov rose with exaggerated confidence. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have presented undeniable evidence." He shot Zelenskyy a smirk. "And we are now ready to conclude." He paced, hands clasped behind his back. "The defense has tried to distract you with clever rhetoric, but facts don't lie. The video, the testimony, the corruption, it's all there. The prosecution rests." He took his seat, a triumphant glint in his eyes. Judge Whitmore turned to Zelenskyy. "Mr. Zelenskyy, you may proceed with your defense." Zelenskyy stood slowly, smoothing his jacket. "Thank you, Your Honor." He approached the jury, letting the silence stretch. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice measured. "Antonov says facts don't lie, and I agree." He turned to the projector screen, "which is why I'd like to introduce one last fact into evidence." Dmytro, standing near the back, tapped his phone. The screen lit up, and suddenly, a new video played. Not the one Antonov had shown, the real video. The courtroom gasped. There was no money, no bribe, no Zelenskyy. Instead, the footage showed an entirely different man, one whose face had been digitally altered to resemble him. The time-stamped data, undeniable proof of tampering, flashed in the corner, and the final dagger, the forensic report tracing the forgery, back to Antonov's own office. The color drained from Antonov's face. Zelenskyy turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, I wasn't on trial here." He gestured toward the screen. He was. Pandemonium. The gallery erupted. Journalists scrambled to capture the moment. Judge Whitmore slammed the gavel. Order. Order in the court. But the damage was done. Antonov opened his mouth to argue, to deny, but it was over. The truth wasn't just out. It had crushed him. The courtroom was chaos. Journalists shouted into cameras. Flashes illuminated the stunned faces of the prosecution, and murmurs rippled through the jury box like a rising tide. Antonov sat frozen, his hands clenched into fists on the table. Just hours ago, he had been on the verge of what he thought was an easy victory. Now, he was a man drowning in his own deception. Judge Whitmore pounded the gavel, his voice cutting through the noise. "Enough. There will be order in my courtroom." Slowly, the room settled, though tension still buzzed in the air. The judge turned to the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreman, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes, stood. "We have, Your Honor." Zelenskyy remained still, his face unreadable. He had done everything he needed to do. Now, it was out of his hands. The foreman cleared his throat. "On the charge of corruption and abuse of power, we find the defendant." A pause. The entire courtroom held its breath. "Not guilty." The room erupted. Cheers, gasps, outrage from Antonov's camp. Reporters rushed to file their stories. Zelenskyy exhaled slowly. He hadn't doubted it, not really, but hearing the words still sent a quiet surge of relief through him. He turned to Antonov, whose face was now a mask of shock and fury. Judge Whitmore eyed the prosecution table with barely concealed disdain. "It appears this court has been played for fools. There will be a full investigation into the evidence presented by the prosecution. This trial is dismissed." The gavel slammed down one last time. Zelenskyy stood, adjusting his cuffs, as the courtroom exploded into movement. Reporters rushed toward him, but he ignored them. Instead, he walked past Antonov, pausing just long enough to murmur, "Next time, pick a better script." Antonov didn't respond. He couldn't. His career was over, and he knew it. Dmytro caught up to Zelenskyy as they exited. "I can't believe you pulled that off," he muttered. "You just turned a courtroom into a stage." Zelenskyy smirked. "No, Dmytro, they did that for me." Outside, the world was waiting. But for Zelenskyy, this wasn't just a win. It was proof that no matter how powerful the forces against you, truth, when wielded correctly, was the ultimate power move.